What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a little bit of information about what I would consider the greatest challenge in CRPG gaming, and that is none other than the Ultimate in Pillars of Eternity 2. A challenge so over the top that only 14 people have ever been confirmed to have finished it. And honestly, I've got a lot to say on this one, but I've been talking a lot about Pillars of Eternity 2 recently, and obviously this challenge is associated with that, and I'm a huge CRPG guy, so it's come up. So basically, I want to run through what the challenge is, where it came from, what it's all about, strategies, etc. Now, full disclosure, this challenge is like on my bucket list of things I want to accomplish on this channel over the course of my lifetime. Now, right away, I will say that technically speaking, it is possible that more than 14 people have completed this, and that is because the challenge itself is represented in-game by a very trackable thing, but in order to be confirmed, you have to send your save file for the challenge as well as a complete video recording over to Obsidian at a special email address, and then for the first 50 players to have completed it, they will send you back a confirmation letter as well as a woven patch claiming that you beat the Ultimate, which should be serving as the thumbnail for this video, in fact. Now, the first 12 people got their names and character names engraved on a plaque that is hanging in Obsidian's offices all the way out in Irvine, California. Now, my initial experience with this challenge was listening to an update video provided on the game as they released all sorts of updates for this as it was in development. It got a lot of post-launch support, 3 DLCs in fact, so Pillars 2 saw a lot of post-launch love, and they enjoyed putting out videos to coincide with that. But one of those videos I remember very distinctly when they announced the Ultimate, a video where they said they weren't even entirely sure if it was possible. If that gives you some idea of how difficult this actually is to pull off. But to give a little bit of background on the challenge itself, when Pillars 2 first launched, it actually got a lot of feedback that it was too easy, and the developers apparently took that real personal and set about making it much more difficult. Now, this came in the usual forms of things like balancing, etc., but also in the addition of what are called Magran's Fires, special god-related challenges that you can take on to make the game more difficult in a very customizable and modular way. Basically, on the main menu of the game, there exists a small hidden submenu where you can enable Magran's Fires, all of these challenges. And we'll go over each of them individually, but in the final update for the game, they added the Ultimate, which is beating the game while every single one of these challenges is active, and not just beating the game, but also having to defeat each and every optional boss, including the additional super bosses that were added post-launch as well. Now, this itself actually harkens back to an achievement in the original Pillars of Eternity, known as the Ultimate. Now, the version in Pillars 1 is actually much easier, at least by comparison, and this is because it only requires you to play what is known as Triple Crown Solo. This means that you play the game on Expert Mode, Trial of Iron, and Path of the Damned. Now, individually, Expert Mode is a mode that disables some helper features, and you have to know a little bit more about what you're doing, frankly. Trial of Iron being an Iron Man mode, and Path of the Damned being the game's hardest difficulty, and Solo, of course, simply meaning solo. Now, Pillars 2 is much harder because in addition to all of that, you also have to take on all of these different deity challenges, while also defeating all of those bosses that I mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about each of these challenges individually, because honestly, individually, they're not so bad. It's when you combine all of these that they become borderline impossible. Starting with the Aethys challenge. This basically means you have to beat the game by a certain date, and every quest step also has this date as well, which essentially means you're on a bit of a time crunch. Now, this is very front-loaded. The first few objectives of the game have a pretty short timer. You only have a few days for the first one, and then that slowly expands until you have a couple months to finish the game by at the end. This means that if you get past that initial hurdle, you'll actually have a lot more time, so it becomes not so bad. Our second one is Galawain's challenge. Beasts gain random powerful effects. This will cause some monsters in the game to simply get extra boons to fight you with at random, which can be not a great time. Now, some challenges, like the third one here, Bereth challenge, it actually gets somewhat nerfed by completing it as part of the Ultimate. So here, any party member knocked out for more than 10 seconds or 3 turns in turn-based just straight up dies. However, if you're playing solo, that's kind of irrelevant. Now, the other part of it, the cannot flee from combat part sounds bad, but is actually sometimes helpful. In fact, one in particular very, I would say, popular, approach to this challenge, which like 10 of the 14 confirmations have utilized, basically lets you abuse always being in combat. And this is because Pillars uses a lot of in-combat buffing instead of allowing you to buff before fights. And so basically you can use a trick or two to start combat in stealth and then buff yourself to the 9s before actually jumping in. So this challenge winds up being a bit of a nothing burger by comparison. But then we have Magrin's challenge, which is, of course, the namesake of Magrin's Fires. This causes the game not to be able to be paused at all in real-time with pause mode, the game's default, and then in turn-based mode, the turn passes automatically after 10 seconds. Now, in turn-based mode, this is awful, but in real-time with pause mode, the game actually features a slow mode that you can activate and deactivate as you please, which will effectively mitigate this. You just can't fully pause the game, so it becomes real-time with slow, which isn't so bad. Then there's Abaddon's challenge. This one's actually a bit annoying because equipment will degrade over time and require it to be repaired, and this will be an extreme problem for armor and things in the boss fights with the super bosses, because those fights will go on so long that armor simply isn't going to last. And this means that a lot of the challengers for this have actually beat a lot of these bosses in nothing, or at least their main suit of armor, that is. You can equip a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't get broken this way, but it's something to know. Now for Skane's challenge, you get a reduced fog of war, especially at night and indoors. Holding a torch will help offset this, but this can be a real problem in terms of locating various enemies, which means you have to know the maps of the game very, very well. Then we have Andra's challenge. So you'll be sailing around the Deadfire as part of this challenge, and this challenge increases the severity and size of the storms on the map, and it is not by a small amount. The storms become gigantic and potentially quite deadly, so you'll want to do everything you can to avoid them, which basically just means getting the game's fastest ship as early as possible. Then there is Rimmergan's challenge. This will cause food items to spoil. While you are sailing, you have to feed and provide drink to your sailors and crewmen, and normally this is pretty easy because it's so abundant. But with this challenge, that stuff spoils after so many in-game days and becomes rotten. And this is another challenge that's very front-loaded. It's quite annoying in the early hours, but once you get some money under your belt, you'll be able to very easily outfit yourself with more than enough here, and it becomes not so bad. But then we have probably the single hardest part of this challenge, and that is Hylia's challenge. This causes a small Orlin girl to follow you around, and if she dies, it's game over. So you have to find ways to protect this small child, not least of which because enemies love to attack her specifically. So you have to get creative in how you're approaching combat, because she's not exactly a tank. Now, whenever you enter combat, or she gets close enough to an enemy in combat, I should say, she'll go into a frightened state and just run around that general area until combat ends. You can actually use that to your advantage as well, getting her to stick in a specific spot, or using a priest spell like Withdraw in order to protect her, as that effectively removes her from the battlefield for a time. Then we have Wodika's challenge. Per encounter, resources become per rest, which is pretty impactful. Health no longer regenerates outside of combat, and while camping, you have to use prepared meals. Now that sounds like a lot, but there are classes that will mitigate this entirely. For instance, the Blood Wizard just straight up offsets most of these by being able to sacrifice health for spell slots, and then using a spell like Barring Death's Door as a priest, you can actually abuse that pretty well. But a lot of classes can't do that, and so this one's pretty deadly for everybody else. Another very difficult one, though, is Whale's challenge. This effectively obscures most of the game's information. A lot of things where you would see damage numbers, etc., just become little question marks instead, which is another instance where you just have to know what those things do at the very least in terms of raw numbers or even just how much money you have. And there are ways of figuring that out. For instance, you can go to a trade menu if you have the rough price of an individual good and figure out how much money you have that way. And of course, just knowledge goes a long way there. And then the final challenge is, of course, the ultimate, doing all of these at once, with the demand that you also defeat all the bosses at the same time. So with all of that information, you can probably see why this challenge is so incredibly difficult. But in spite of that, we are nonetheless 14 challengers deep at this point, which means there are some generalities to how this can go. By far, the most popular choice in terms of tackling this has turned out to be the Blood Wizard subclass for Wizard with a multi-class of a Priest of Skane. These two specifically actually have the potential to offset basically everything I just mentioned. Provided, of course, you're willing to do things like respec at key moments, understand how the stealth system works, be able to use all these different items, etc. But they can do things like easily protect Vela with Barring Death's Door, as well as withdraw to keep her protected from enemies. Blood Mage can use their class to restore their spell slots so they don't have to rest very often. And in general, wizards get a whole host of different spells and grimoires to use, which will give them more than enough firepower to kill enemies once they have a way of keeping themselves alive for those fights. Now, despite that being the most popular option by far, it's not the only possibility. A few people have done it with more interesting choices. The latest confirmation of this challenge back on 2022 actually used a Ranger and a Cypher as an example. Cypher seems decently popular as well. A few people have completed the challenge with a Cypher of some sort. And the third person to complete it even managed to mix Tactician Fighter with Priest of Skane. So there are technically a few different options where this is actually possible to do, and because each of these confirmations has to be recorded, you can find a playlist of every single one over on YouTube if you want to do the research and see how people have already been handling this. So with all of that explanation out of the way, let's talk about me now. So, as somebody who is pretty well known for covering CRPGs extensively, this challenge is of course important to me, and I would very much like the honor of having completed it. And up until this point, it's mostly just been a time thing. Now, this challenge was initially announced back in 2019. It is still ongoing, obviously. And that's back when I had a normal job, so there was basically no time to do any of that. And then as this has become my full-time job, I've usually been so tied up with other games that sitting down to do all the research and iteration necessary to make this happen has been hard. But I realistically do have the time these days, if I can, of course, make it. And given that we're coming up on the end of the year and into January when things get slow, I have decided that now seems like a pretty good time to attempt to do this. Some of that is simply because I would like to play a CRPG in a dedicated fashion again for a little while, especially in the slower months of the year, but also simply because I think a challenge like that would be just incredibly satisfying to take on, especially if I manage to pull it off. Now, I will say my approach here is almost certainly going to be pretty boring, and I know that because I've actually made a few attempts at this previously and here pretty recently, actually, just to kind of give myself a bit of a memory jog. Now, I'm really good at like the first roughly 6 to 10 hours of this challenge with the most popular methods, the Blood Mage and the Priest of Skane. Now, where I tend to struggle is when you get to the part of the game where you have to start knocking out all of the bosses that are necessary to actually complete the ultimate, because the rest of those challenges can be mitigated pretty easily, but once you get to the part where you have to start tackling those bosses and the DLC, things get a little complicated, because some of those super bosses, as the name might imply, can be a little bit unpredictable. They tend to have special mechanics that go well beyond the scope of basically everything else. And so for me, those tend to be where I mess something up and potentially die, which has absolutely happened to me in the past. And because this is an Iron Man run, if you die, you don't start at the last save, you start all over. And this basically means that in order to do this effectively, I need to have essentially 2 files going at the same time. The actual main file that I'm completing the challenge on, and then an almost identical second game where I can actually save, basically the same thing but Iron Man turned off, where I'll be able to back out and repeatedly practice a section before doing it on the main file, so to speak. I think that would probably be the most cautious approach possible, and hopefully with enough time to dedicate to it will actually lead to some success. But as I mentioned a little bit ago, it is required that you provide a full video of the run when you actually complete it. This means that not only will I be taking this challenge on, if I actually manage to complete it, you will see, or at least be able to see, the entire playlist. Now, what will likely happen here is that I will record the entire thing, send all of that in when and if I am successful, and then get to work on uploading the successful footage afterwards. But as I mentioned, Obsidian has to have that full video, and you have to send them their save file so they can investigate and make sure you didn't cheat in some manner. So if I ever manage to actually pull this off, you will get to see all of that firsthand, which I think would be really cool. I've done like live streams of me fully playing through CRPGs before, so I don't think that would necessarily be anything new, but the extreme nature of this particular challenge I think would make that probably interesting gameplay for people to watch, if nothing else, even if there wouldn't be any commentary with it. All of that to finally wrap this up and tell you that basically, to me, the Ultimate in Pillars of Eternity 2 represents like the absolute pinnacle of what you can do in CRPGs in terms of challenge. And as somebody who's known as the CRPG guy, I think it would be the ultimate, pun intended, feather in my own cap to be able to say that I absolutely did this. And that makes me want it real bad. But obviously, it's also extremely difficult, so it's hard to say if that will ever actually pan out. But I think here before too long, I'm going to give it a go, which is why it's been on my mind so much, and I thought it might be fun to share all of that information with you, my viewers, and while I don't expect this particular video to do crazy well or anything, I thought it might be fun for people to hear me, A, get excited about something, but also to take part in like this big challenge in a way that isn't, something to do with reviewing games or anything like that, and it's a little bit of a break I could use in the slower months at the same time. So hopefully you found some part of that interesting. Sometimes, I don't know, with videos like this, I just feel like talking about something and, here we are. So if you got anything out of that, I'd certainly be glad to hear about it. Maybe consider subscribing and sticking around. Worst case scenario, I fail and make another video conceding how I just can't do it. But on the off chance I do manage to be successful, you might even be able to see the full run one day. But for now, that's pretty much going to do it. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.